I want you to take your Bibles, if you would, and turn to Matthew chapter 26. We're in the last week of Jesus, and we're looking at different spots along the way that Jesus kind of had significant things happen to him in his life as he was headed to the cross. One of the loneliest places on earth to me is a hospital waiting room. Maybe you've been in one, and you know what it's like, especially when you have a loved one that's in surgery and there's nobody really around. A couple times Pam has had surgery and it's been in the middle of the day and there's been people around and it's been pretty noisy and busy, and that's okay with me. One night, 4 years ago, she ended up with a burst appendix, or a seeping appendix, I guess what you would say. And we took her to the hospital about 6 or 7 at night. And by 1 o'clock in the morning, the doctors had decided they were going to wait and operate on her at 7 in the morning. And then at the last second, the doctor changed his mind and said, "No, I think we better get in there now." He says, "This won't take long at all. Take 45 minutes. We'll get in there, get it out, clean it all up. Everything will be okay." And so it was me and my daughter Lydia were in the waiting room, and we were the only ones in the waiting room. And once 45 minutes went by, it turned into an hour, and then it turned into an hour and a half, and then 2 hours, and then 2.5 hours. And during that time, I've never seen a clock move so slowly as it did there. We weren't getting reports from anybody. We were just sitting there in the dark room. It was pretty dark in there, and there was nobody else in there. And it was lonely. It was very, very lonely. Lydia fell asleep at one point, and I wanted to go to sleep but couldn't. And it was just quiet, so quiet in this room. And finally, this doctor showed up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And he told me and Lydia, he said, it was a lot worse than what I thought it was. Number one, I'll tell you that if we'd have waited till 7 o'clock, there's a likelihood that she would not have lived through the day because her appendix had been seeping for days on end into her abdomen, and it created a lot of sickness for her, really serious sickness. And he explained all of it, and I just remember thinking those 3 hours were just so lonely. You're just so alone. I didn't call anybody. I didn't call anybody at the church. I just thought it was going to be 45 minutes, and they told us to be 45 minutes, and then you'll be out the next day. You'll go home the next day. When we wheeled her up to the room and everything, put her in the room, the nurse says, "Well, she'll be going home later today." And I said, "Well, that's not what the doctor said." "Oh, yeah, she'll be going home later that day." And she was in the hospital 8 days, it turned out, because of all the poison that was in her abdomen and stomach area. That was lonely. And you have a chance when you're kind of alone with your own prayers and your own thoughts. And Lydia is not particularly verbal a lot. I mean, she talks a lot, but in this moment she wasn't talking very much, and really neither was I. It was just quiet, and it was lonely. I think Jesus had moments like that in his last week, even though he was surrounded by lots of people. I think he had moments when he was incredibly alone, and I think he felt it in a very real sense. One of those moments was in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is what we're going to talk about today. We've made this journey now for the last 3 weeks. We started out over here with this perfume jar, and this was the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Bethany. They held a dinner in Jesus' honor. It was shortly after Lazarus had been raised from the dead, and it was Mary who came in and poured that perfume all over Jesus, on his head and on his feet, and washed his feet with her hair with this perfume. And you'll remember that it was Judas, one of the 12, who said that you could do that. This was a year's worth of wages that we could have given to the poor. And of course, John reveals in his gospel that Judas was not the least bit interested in the poor. He was interested in the money. Judas was an embezzler, and he was looking for ways to get his hand on the money, and that's why he saw this as a terrible thing that Mary did. Martha served the meal, which was exactly what Martha would have done, because that's what she did, serve the meal. And Lazarus just kind of took it all in, partly because he was kind of the guest of the honor, because he had been the one raised from the dead, but that was just kind of his deal. He liked to hear what Jesus had to say. Then Jesus took the disciples to an upper room, and he gave them all kinds of instruction. And we just read about this from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, about breaking the bread. This is the body that is broken for you. And we talked about how last week that the bones were never broken in Jesus' body, but his body from head to toe was broken and just stripped and bloodied everywhere it could be, that it could happen. And then he took the juice, and he held the juice up, and he said, "This juice represents the blood of the new covenant." And so we are to do this in remembrance of him. This week when I went on my little trip to Kansas City, the first thing I did is I got into my bag, and I pulled out my picture of Pam. And I told you last week that I take that picture wherever I go. And the guy I was with, he was kind of creeped out by the whole deal, to be honest with you. He was like, "Is she going to watch me the whole time I'm in here?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. She kind of has that presence, you better be good while you're in here with me," and all that kind of stuff. And he said it just really creeped her out. And we talked about last week how the picture of Pam is a representation of Pam. It's not Pam herself, right? And so if you would notice over here is Pam, and if you want to get to know Pam, I would recommend that you get to know her and not just her picture, okay? But the blood and the bread represented the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. That was the juice and the bread, okay? And we talked about how some traditions believe that when you take it, it actually turns into the body of Christ and actually turns into the blood of Christ. And there's no real representation of that in Scripture at all. Jesus says, "This represents my body. This represents my blood. This is the blood of the new covenant." And so today we find ourselves in Gethsemane. And next week we'll talk about the betrayals of Peter and Judas, and we'll kind of get them out of order a little bit, but it'll fit once it all gets done here. But we get to Gethsemane in verse 36 of chapter 26 of Matthew. And I want to read this out loud and have you just follow along with me. It says that Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Now, a couple things to know about Gethsemane. Number one, in the city of Jerusalem, it was against the law to have gardens. You couldn't have gardens that took up lots of space in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was such a compact area and there were people everywhere. They didn't want you taking up space that could be used for people, for trees and gardens. And so most of the gardens were outside of the city of Jerusalem. That's where Gethsemane was. It was on the Mount of Olives. It was not a large place at all, but it was this place probably owned by a very wealthy man who had this garden, and apparently Jesus had permission to take his disciples into Gethsemane, and so he did. And it says there in verse 37 that he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. The two sons of Zebedee would be who? James and John. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." So he took all of his disciples to Gethsemane. He left 8 of them outside of the garden gate. He took 3 inside with him, and that would be James and John and Peter. And then he told them, "You stay here and you pray. I'm going to go off and I'm going to pray." And so that's what he did. Going a little further in verse 39, he fell to his face to the ground and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you keep watch with me for an hour, 1 hour?" he said. He asked Peter that question. "And watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And he went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." And the Bible says that when he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. And so he left them and went away once more and prayed a third time, saying the same thing. And then he returned to his disciples, or to the disciples, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And of course, he was talking specifically about Judas at that point. He knew Judas was coming. So Jesus went into this garden to pray for a while. And while gardens weren't allowed in the city of Jerusalem, this rich individual had this place where Jesus could kind of gather himself in what was called Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. And if you can think about this a little bit, about what it means to press the olives in order to get the juice out, it's a time of testing and a time of pain and difficulty and sorrow in a lot of ways. And that's often what happened in this garden. This was a place where people went when they were overwhelmed with sorrow in their life. These were not necessarily moments that were meant to be refreshing. They weren't moments when Jesus would say, "Oh, I feel so much better now," at all. This is where he is going to come into contact and confrontation with the agonizing moments that are ahead for him. And this is going to be hard. And so with the trials and the beatings of Jesus, all in the shadow of the cross looming over Jesus, he went to this garden. And Matthew tells us that he took Peter and James and John with him in the garden himself. Now, some people wonder why. Well, why would he take those three guys? Well, they were kind of the inner circle. He drew a lot of strength from them. That would be one reason. It was also, these guys were with him from the very beginning. And so that might be another reason that he would have them close there. They weren't perfect people at all. And so they didn't have their act together. Sometimes they were the last to get what Jesus was talking about. If you think about it and read through the Gospels, you see that Peter, James, and John weren't always the brightest bulbs on the tree, okay, so to speak. And they weren't real clear about what was going to happen over the next 36 hours at all. But these were Jesus' guys. They were Jesus' guys, and right now Jesus needed them next to him, praying for him, and praying that they would not fall into temptation either. He also knew that they were going to experience in the coming hours some things that would shake them to the core. And because of that, they had to get ready. Because soon they would be the ones that would be the leaders of what we have called this year the Bold Beginnings Church, the start of the church in the book of Acts. And so there are some things here that Gethsemane reminds us of that I think drive home who Jesus is and who we are. First of all, Gethsemane reminds us of Jesus' humanity, his humanity. Jesus tells them to sit while he goes into the garden to pray. I think Jesus had expected them to come in and to pray in support of him as he faced this terrible intersection in his life. Verse 37 says that he began to be sorrowful and troubled. That means that he was overwhelmed. He probably knew exactly what he was getting into and how it was all going to come about. And he had a lifetime to prepare for this, but now it was coming down to these moments. The one thing that we cannot forget about Jesus, and sometimes we're quick to forget this, is he was not only fully God, but he was fully man too. And so his humanity was rising up in him. And he was struggling with this. Anyone who would face what Jesus was facing in those moments might have been horribly conflicted and emotionally drained in every imaginable way. That's the way Jesus was. The writer of Hebrews gives us a glimpse of this when he writes in Hebrews chapter 5, while Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. So here's Jesus praying to God through loud cries and tears, and God hears his prayers because of his deep devotion or reverence to God. Nevertheless, not my will be done, but yours be done. Whatever's going to happen here, I want your will to be done. If there's another way, I'd like it to be another way. But if it cannot happen any other way, then let it happen your way. And that verse in Hebrews really reveals that Jesus is no emotionless deity who wouldn't feel any of the internal conflict that any of us would have felt in this kind of circumstance. We all would feel this way. In other words, Jesus wasn't an actor playing a part at all. He was fully God and fully human at the same time, and he was struggling through this. He pleaded with his Father for another way. And so imagine how we would feel if Jesus had just gone all the way to the cross and the story never reveals any emotion and no feeling at all on Jesus' part. We would think he was a robot. We would think that he's just doing what he's told. This comes from somebody who has a deep humanity and a deep caring for the very people that he's going to save. And so this was a difficult time for him. Matthew says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, so stay here and keep watch with me." Literally, what that text means is Jesus was completely surrounded by sorrow, and it weighed down on him. Have you ever been there? You ever had a circumstance in your life where the weight of the sorrow of your life just weighed on you and knocked you down? Most of us have had one or two of those moments in our life. What was it for Jesus? It was about separation, is what it was. He would be separated from God, the Father, because the sins of the world would be put on him. He would have to carry on the weight of the sins of the world, past, present, and future, which he was sinless in every way. And so that was imposing in his way, in his life as well. And these sins would be placed on him so that we could be forgiven by a sinless Lamb of God. This was a terrible time for Jesus. And some of us have had those moments in our lives. Most of the time, they're not too earth-shattering, but every once in a while, you come across a circumstance in your life where loss seems to be a big part of what you're going through. Last week, we went to eat dinner at some friend's house across the street, and I walked in, and we were invited for dinner. The first thing I said was, "How's your week been?" And he said to me, "Not very good." And you know, there's that point right there where you go, why did I ask that question? You know? Because you're supposed to have a nice dinner and everything, you know, and the rules say you're supposed to say, "Oh, it was great." And he said, "Oh, that's great. And my week was great," but he didn't. And the reason it wasn't is that because their very closest friends had been in each other's weddings. The friend's wife had had a miscarriage, a stillborn baby, right at the due date. And he said, "It's been a really, really hard week. Really hard." And Pam and I were able to minister to them because of some of the experiences that we've had with our daughters along the way, and to encourage them and to say, God's going to get them through this, but we know a little bit about how hard that is. And I could see in Brian's face, it was complete sorrow, and it weighed on him. Those happen in our life every once in a while. And becomes difficult. We have our hearts broken. Sometimes our hearts are broken by our kids. And they can be broken so deeply and so hard that if anybody asks, "How's things going?" you can't say anything but, "Not very good. Not right now. It's not." That's the truth. Sometimes they're broken by people that we love and know in the church. And it hurts. Sometimes they're broken by family members. Other family members break our hearts. We know that. And what happens a lot of time, if we're not careful, we end up falling into this black hole that people fall into, and they never ever climb out because life is no good for them anymore. And that's the kind of depth of sorrow that Jesus was dealing with in Gethsemane. It was his humanity that was coming through. We also are reminded in Gethsemane of the disciples' frailty. The disciples' frailty. Now, there's a lot of speculation here about what Jesus meant when he said, "Sit here and watch with me." Some people think that what he meant was the guards are coming and Judas is coming, and when they do, put up the best fight you can. That doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound very biblical at all, according to the story. And as a matter of fact, Jesus' response to Peter, who cut the servant's ear off, doesn't suggest that Jesus was looking for a fight at all. Some people think that they were there just to protect Jesus in case they came too soon. Well, there were 8 disciples outside the garden, and there were Judas, or James and John and Peter inside the garden, and Judas was coming with the Romans, so there was going to be a confrontation somewhere along the way. We know that. But we also know that Jesus says to his disciples, I want you to pray that you don't fall into temptation. That you don't fall into temptation. Now, that kind of confuses me just a little bit. And what did they do? Well, they fell asleep. Now, I try to have grace toward people who sleep during my sermons. I know exactly where you sit. And so I don't even have to look a lot of times. I can just see, People fall asleep, don't they? It's okay. I'm glad you're here. If you don't snore really bad, that's okay, if you happen to have a long night. One of the reasons that's true, and for me, one of the reasons I've been sensitive to that is that I tried out at a church in southern Missouri to preach one time, and it was when I was in college, and I tried out a Sunday after another guy tried out. And you go and you preach this sermon, and you stay with the elder, the chairman of the elders. You stay with them all weekend. And the guy just kind of let me know that he hoped that I wasn't like the last guy who did some things during the sermon that weren't very nice. Because he sat right on the front row, and he fell asleep, and he started to snore. And this guy was preaching on Daniel and the lion's den, and so he kind of built the story up a little bit. And then he says, and when the lions roared, like that, and he leaned right over in the guy's face, and the guy jumped out of his chair, thought something was going on, and this guy thought, see, I'll teach him a lesson. Well, I learned that whenever I think I'm teaching somebody a lesson, usually I'm the one that's going to get the lesson taught to. You know how that goes? You see, this guy had been up since 3 o'clock in the morning milking cows. That's what he does every day. When he comes to church, sometimes he falls off. And sometimes it's not his fault. Sometimes it's the preacher's fault. And so I made a note to myself, change the sermon from Daniel in the lion's den to Jesus wept, and be real quiet about it, kind of a thing. Well, we can be really too hard on the disciples, can't we? And we can wonder why they fell asleep. It was the middle of the night. Okay, I get that. It had been a crazy week, and it was even going to get crazier. I get that. Their emotions were raw too. You think about it, all this stuff that Jesus is dealing with, these disciples were dealing with it, but they were dealing with it from a point of the unknown. They didn't know exactly what was going to happen. Jesus did. And so, how many of us, when we've been kind of unclear about what's going on around us, have found ourselves nodding off and falling asleep in one way or another? And some of you're asleep right now. Okay, you don't even know I'm asking the question. And that's okay, because we have frailty, don't we? None of us are perfect. And that's the way it was with James and Peter and John and the rest of the disciples. They weren't perfect. They didn't handle this perfect. It reminds us of Jesus' humanity, but it also reminds us of our own frailty. And then Gethsemane reminds us of the sinfulness that's been placed upon Christ, our sinfulness. The one person that was not sleeping in Gethsemane that day was Jesus. Jesus was praying. And he was praying with a heartfelt prayer in which he said, this cup is too much. This is going to be way beyond anything anybody's ever seen before. And God, if there's another way to do this, then let's do it. And you'll notice that when he prayed that prayer, he got off by himself and prayed that prayer. He didn't pray it in front of James and John and Peter. He went off by himself. My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. Now, what was that cup? He wasn't talking so much about the juice there as he was talking about, a lot of times in the Bible, the word cup is associated with suffering. So this was the cup of suffering. Jesus knew what was going to happen. And this was a very honest struggle that Jesus was going through. This is the cup which Jesus talks about, which would mean everything from the betrayals to the trials to the crucifixion to the death and to the burial and to the separation that Jesus would feel between him and God because of sin and the incredible weight of our sin on Jesus' life. That's why I love 2 Corinthians 5:21, which said, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. To be sin. So when I think about what Jesus felt about in the cross, it becomes very personal in the light of this verse. It was my sin. It was the agony of him bearing my sin in my life. Not the sin of my neighbor or my wife or my mom or my dad or somebody else in church. It was my sin that weighed down on him so hard. And that's what you should feel too. Because the agony that Jesus felt in the garden was because he took up your sin. He took up everyone's sin. This was personal with Jesus. Now, it's hard for me to grasp this personally, so a writer by the name of Mike Mosley wrote about it and captured it in a way that I could never capture it. And I'm going to quote him. It's a little bit long, but I think it says exactly what was going on in Gethsemane. These are very humbling and shocking words. He writes, Jesus will bear the sins of the Assyrians who gloated over their captives when they skinned people alive. Jesus will bear the sins of SS troop machine gunning women and children who ran from burning synagogues with their clothes ablaze. Jesus will bear the sins of child molesters, making sure their victims never testify. Jesus will bear the sins of pharaohs, sacrificing thousands of laborers' lives to build them a deifying tomb. Jesus took all of this and more. He was tossed about in the endless storm of enraged fathers beating toddlers to death, pimps seducing runaways into the lives of drugs and prostitution, Canaanites burning their children to Moloch, nice church ladies cannibalizing nice other church ladies over coffee, impoverished parents in China selling their children to slavery. He will bear the sins of the Bible-believing leaders who pray and pray out loud while their wives sit back in pews praying that the heavy makeup that covers their bruises won't run. Jesus will tumble alone. He will bear the sins of embezzlers, gangsters, bullies, rapists, liars, the indifferent, the sadistic, and the self-righteous. It's a scene of unbearable horror and unspeakable madness. He's accused for all of us, bearing the weight of all abused children, families destroyed by adultery or apathy, civilizations decaying, wars ravaging victims. Yet through it all, deep in the terror of hell, he keeps his eyes wide open. And finally, the tumbling will slow a bit, and the storms will slacken, and Jesus will lift himself on his nailed feet to snatch a gasp of air and force his swollen face to shout out, "It is finished. I've come. I've seen. I've paid for. I have felt." And he finishes with this. He says, "Is it any wonder that in the garden Jesus prayed, 'My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me'?" You see, he came back then from the back to the Father with some resolve and strength. And in verse 42, he says, "If it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink, may your will be done." Wow. And what we know at that point is that Jesus is all in. He's all in. No amount of pain and agony and suffering will deter him from the mission that God has given him. The line had to be drawn in the sand. The enemy had no power over Jesus whatsoever. And he would say to his betrayer later, "Come and do what you came to do." In verse 50, there was no looking back, no doubt in his mind, no turning back at all. Which leads me to the last thing about Gethsemane. And that is, it reminds us of the conflict between mission and me. Mission and me. Gethsemane was the place where Jesus had to decide once and for all that he would accomplish the mission of God, which was to bear the sins of the world. And guess what? That's a battle for all of us, isn't it? Every one of us have this battle that goes on in our soul, in which we decide whether we're going to be on mission for God or whether we're going to be on mission for me. And it is a daily battle. No matter who we are, if we're really living for God, then me takes a back seat. But often we fight over that front seat, don't we? Because it's mission or me. And that's especially tragic or even difficult because it is a challenge that we all face every day of our lives. Moms, you make that decision 100 times a day, don't you? Is it going to be a mission? Is it going to be mission, or is it going to be me? You have those children, and when you're forced to decide, it's mission that you choose. God's given you a mission. You protect, you love, you care for your children, you laugh, you cry, you clothe, you feed those children. Even when you don't feel like it, you do it because it's mission that counts. Mom and Dad, you make that decision every day multiple times. You are disciple makers. You've been entrusted with children that God expects you to lead in discipleship. And you too have to choose too, don't you? You have to choose whether you're going to follow the mission of God and help your children become disciples, or whether you're just going to do what you want to do. And sometimes that involves hard decisions and difficult decisions. Do I get involved or do I stay absent? Do I say yes because everybody else's parent lets them do this, or do I stay on the mission to help my children be disciples of Jesus? Husbands and wives, you make this decision every day. Are you going to stay on mission with God, or are you going to do your own thing? Will you sacrifice what you think is good for you so that you can have what is good for both of you, which is God's mission? It's about mission or me. Teenagers, you make this decision every moment of your life, every moment of every day. There are so many temptations and so many opportunities for you to go off the rails in your life, and you have to decide over and over and over again, is it going to be God's mission or is it going to be my mission? And that's a lifetime journey for all of us. You see, living for God means that you're going to go all the way for God. It means that you're going to face the sorrows of life with courage, even when it's mixed with pain and suffering. Living for God means you're going to have to make choices, make real choices, choices that are right, that you're going to have to choose to follow God rather than choosing to follow me. And that me is not going to be in the driver's seat of your life. It's going to be the mission of God. And when you feel that pang of guilt or that pang of struggle and disappointment in your life, maybe because you chose me rather than the mission of God, then what you need to do is you need to go find your garden. And you need to fall on your face, and you need to resolve in your heart that you will live for the mission of God and not the mission of me. That's what Jesus did. And when I think of it in those terms, then I'm overwhelmed with the thought that Jesus chose God's mission for me. Knowing what he would go through for me motivates my life with a sense of mission for God. And it's not always easy. Sometimes it's difficult. Having a clear sense of mission helped Pam and I parent 4 kids. And it wasn't always easy. And it was sometimes very hard. And now we have 8 grandkids and 3 son-in-laws and all of that. It just gets harder. More people involved. But what we always come back to is, what's our mission? What are we called to do? We are called to be disciple makers. And we are called to love our kids that way, and to love our grandkids that way, and to love our church that way, to be disciple makers. And it's not always easy, but it is a choice that has to be made on a daily basis. And when we're not perfect and we don't always choose the right way, then we have to find our way back to the garden, Gethsemane. And the prayer will be something like what Jesus prayed. If there's any other way, God, take it from me. But if there's not, then I will do what you want me to do, because your mission is more important than me. And that's a heartfelt prayer that we could all pray when we find ourselves in Gethsemane. Would you bow your heads with me, please? Father, as we travel this last week with Jesus, we see that every step of the way it gets more intense. It goes from this idea of a dinner in honor of Jesus and Lazarus in worship, to this idea of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, and then Gethsemane kind of appears, and now all of a sudden there's something really at stake here, and that's whether or not Jesus is going to follow your mission for him, and whether we're going to follow your mission for us, or whether we're going to choose me. And I pray, God, I pray today that you would remind us of that choice every time we're confronted with issues during the week, and that you'd remind us that we need to choose your mission. And there are going to be times that we fail. There are going to be times that we don't choose right. So would you remind us, God, as we think about those times, that we always have a garden to go to, a place that we can go to where we can pour out our heartfelt sorrow and disappointment, and where we can renew, God, renew our commitment to your mission over me. Thank you for this.